We're going to mention some characters that I think really bring out what reached me this week in these stories. Well, first of all, the Green Pastures. If you know Psalm 23, he makes us lie down in green pastures. And as we look at the first couple of verses, I'm not sure why it stood out to me, but when it says, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord, my soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord." Honestly, it fell flat when I first read it. There was nothing I could really appeal to that helped me say, okay, how do you preach this? Until I started thinking back to the lives of men like Joseph, right? And we've talked about Joseph before. Joseph wasn't such a great fit even within his family. He had brothers that didn't like him so much. And when he was booted out of the family into a place of servitude in another man's house, he wasn't a great fit in that house no matter how well he worked. And when he went from the house to the prison, he wasn't necessarily a great fit in the prison, even though he seemed like he was starting to fit in a little bit more, if you look at the story, than he was even in his own house or in the house where he was a great servant. And finally, after he was forgotten for so long, after showing the kindness to the one who survived the interpretation of the dreams, he was finally lifted up into becoming second in command of the entire kingdom of Egypt. And understand why that mattered so much to me. See, there are certain places where we shouldn't necessarily be a good fit, even though our hearts all crave to be a good fit somewhere. See, even though Joseph wasn't a great fit in his own family, even though he wasn't a terribly great fit in Potiphar's house, and clearly you have to guess he wasn't feeling like he should be a great fit in the jail, all destined by God in command of the entire kingdom of Egypt. Understand how we talk so much about David, but it's the same thing. David wasn't necessarily a family, right? David wasn't even necessarily a great fit in the kingdom, and sometimes it's because in the kingdom. That means you don't find your fit until bumping around in places where you're safe. Not too long ago, an illustration I was really planning to use last week came from a Super Bowl. Not too long ago, where the Philadelphia Eagles played the New England Patriots, who seem like they're there every year, right? And if not them, Tom Brady. Gotcha. But the irony of that particular Super Bowl was there were two quarterbacks. Only takes one to start, right? But there were two quarterbacks who featured prominently. And ironically enough, it's hard to find one quarterback who's willing to speak up for God. You had two quarterbacks on the same team who made it obvious who their strength came from. And as one went down, the other had to step up, and it was the backup who won the Super Bowl. His name is Nick Foles. The starter was Carson Wentz. They're still proudly professing to be believers. And as Nick Foles broke his collarbone not too long ago, finally the starter, the thing that he knew was on his heart to be, he reached another adversity, and he said, if I can praise God after winning the Super Bowl, I can praise God with the broken collarbone. In a lot of ways reminiscent of what we see in David. Even in down times, he's able to still offer prayers, not simply clinging to the Super Bowl moments, but praising God just like Job. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so why is that important? See, I'm not sure that either Nick Foles or Carson Wentz should be a great fit on the New England Patriots. I can't say from an outsider's perspective that the New England Patriots are a non-Christian team, but I can say that a quarterback who professes Christ might not be a great fit keeping the secrets of a team that's recording the other team's practices illegally, that's deflating balls on the eve of the Super Bowl, right? And so understand, much like Joseph and David, it's appealing for us as believers to try to force a fit in places where we simply shouldn't be a fit. Why? Because they're successful. They're winning. And when you're on the outs, sometimes it's tempting to simply cut corners and go to places where it makes me kind of reflect on my own life and say, maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe I need to change up my game plan, not necessarily because of anything wrong that God has done, but I'm just not sure whether I'm doing it right. Maybe I'm being too holy, quote, or maybe he's punishing me for the fact that I haven't been holy enough. Either way, the temptation can be to look, as they say, to the grass that's greener on the other side of the fence, to cut corners, to start joining places where I really shouldn't be a good fit. But see, if I do those things, then what happens is I miss out on my opportunity for God to exalt me to the place where I should be. See, we never know. If Nick Foles had been Tom Brady's backup, he might have spent his entire career as Tom Brady's backup as opposed to a Super Bowl winning quarterback. And so it's so important to wait on God's timing, even though the adversity is a mixed bag of blessings. It's a mixed bag of those opportunities where God actually does encourage us to do the right thing, but those times where over and over again, beginning almost even before really Psalm 10, but starting at least with Psalm 10, we hear over and over again that call for how long, an answer from God, hopefully giving us a better picture of what we've seen over and over again. People who know that there is an out date to their suffering, but they don't necessarily know when it would be. And it would be really encouraging for God to give us an out date, so I'm not tempted to jump ship and partner up with people who I know don't fit with who I am as a believer. And so what we see in the lives of David and Joseph are people who, whether or not they had control of it, they were people who had to wait until they had a fit. We've talked about not simply David and Joseph, we've talked about barren women in the Bible, right? Those who might look to say, like Hannah, she's being misjudged by the fact that in the depth of her despair, her mouth is moving, no words are coming out, and even the man of God is misunderstanding what she's doing. She's going to a place where she should be able to find comfort, and there is no comfort there through no fault of her own. We talked about the difference between sin. When I sin, I have a reason to be ashamed, but there are certain things we bear as Christians as reproach that have nothing to do with the wrong you've done, but they still put you in a position of public shame, even in places where you should be able to find peace. And so these barren women had this one thing in common. They were born into a shame that had nothing to do with their sin, but it had everything to do with, like Joseph and like David, the fact that they were created for a position of honor that required them to suffer through long periods of doubt where I'm sure they wondered why and for how long. Right? So we see this picture when we look at this verse in Psalm 84. My soul longs and faints for the courts of the Lord. Understand why when you're stuck in the depths of that doubt, how being in the courts of the Lord is a relief. Joseph, when you're in the midst of a place where doing the right thing makes you the oddball, how much do you crave being a place where you're actually encouraged for doing what's right, for being the one who is actually trustworthy to give your father an honest report? How much do you crave, David, a place where risking your life for the bear and the sheep doesn't make you seem like a fool who's risking his life over dinner, but it makes you the kind of person where everybody around you actually applauds, even when you're in the midst of people who would use it as a cause to vilify? How much barren women, when you're waiting through no fault of your own, would you love to be in a place where people who understand even what you don't, why you're waiting, why you've been ostracized, why you don't fit through no fault of your own? And so when I thought about it through the lens of those three stories, it started to make sense. Verse 2, my soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord. Because if we are able in righteousness to resist the temptation to simply align ourselves with the kinds of encouragement we can get here by cutting corners and missing the mark, then there is a place where we finally fit that is more exalted than any place we could try to fit into here on this plane. As we continue, even the sparrow finds a home and the swallow a nest for herself where she may lay her young at your altars, O Lord of hosts, and my King and my God. And originally with that first theme, we're going to turn to Isaiah 11. Actually, I was going to start in Isaiah 11 and read the first few verses and be like, this is a great lens through which to view this entire psalm. Why? Because if you're in a household, one of the best things you can do is learn the tendencies of the home owner. Why? Because it's easy to wear out a welcome if you are in a place where you're doing one thing and the homeowner has a tradition of doing something else. And Isaiah 11 is a chapter that gives us an idea of what the homeowner is like, but we don't have time to go through that today. Why? Because the air conditioning is a little bit But I think it'll help us get an idea of what's going on in this particular passage if we at least go there for a moment to Isaiah 11, beginning at verse 6. Beginning at verse 6 of Isaiah 11. This is a messianic prophecy talking about in verse 1, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse. So we commonly understand that that's talking about the Christ. But the environment that he is looking to establish, we'll see part of it beginning in verse 6. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. Please understand Psalm 84, verse 3 in that context, when the sparrow and the swallows are even looking to make a nest in the house of the Lord, or at the altar of the house of the Lord. Once again, an appeal to mothers. Mama, this is a place where no one is seeking to hurt your children. That's not the world we live in now. And so some of those concerns that we have here in this plane, trying to protect, trying to, as we sometimes heard as the cliche component of our old school prayers, guide, guard, and direct, right? Some of the anxiety that goes along with all of those things, those are anxieties that are simply missing in the house of the Lord, right? You are of value, much more value than many sparrows. That's the text that I thought about in looking at this one today and understanding that even the birds that are most defenseless, these aren't birds of prey. These aren't birds that are notorious for being a danger to anything other than maybe worms, right? Small insects. But understand that even the worms and the small insects, if they have a place in heaven, I can't quote you a scripture on it, even they find safety there. Because the homeowner is one who is looking to establish a place of peace and of rest for everybody who makes it there. And as many of our songs have pointed out this morning, well, how do I get there? The whole point is, once we find our way back to the path, after stumbling, we realize that we have a place as well as a responsibility. See, our place is in a home where there is no threat, there's no danger, even to the weakest of creation. But our responsibility is to be the kind of people who aren't threatening even to the least of these. The sparrow can feel safe around me just as well as it can around God. Because God doesn't have to look out and look over our shoulder at every turn anymore. Everybody who gets there is simply put aside the sin and the weight that so easily ensnares so that everyone can feel safe around everyone else. How do you know that, Marcus? You making it up? No. When Jesus himself spoke the parable of the weeds, he talked about, don't mess with the weeds until the time of the harvest, where God's angels will take out of his kingdom everything that causes sin. And then understand, back in Psalm 84, one of the things I left out in verse 2 is, my heart and flesh sing for joy to the living God. Why is it that his flesh would sing for joy? I can't say for sure, but I do know that in those moments when I finally made a turn away from the thing that I need to stay away from, one of the worst things is hearing those calls to come back to the path I diligently tried to leave behind. And so understand how the anxiety is freed when you're in a place where nobody's calling you back to the paths you've left. Nobody's tempting you to go back to the old ways. One of my favorite translations of Revelation 21 verse 4 is, all the old ways are gone. He's not talking about the good ways. God is the source of everything good. I'm firmly convinced that when the English Revised Standard translated it that way, they meant all of the old ways that would tempt us to go back to where we've been, to paths we've looked to steer clear of. And so understand, additionally, part of the reason why I asked the question of what's your potential is ask yourself, what's my potential in a place where I no longer have to worry about temptation? What's my potential in a place where all I have to do is align my ways with God, and he will take care of everything else which seek to distract me and pull me back to the places I want to leave. One of the places where he also talks about the trials or the woes that await those who cause sin is in Matthew 18. He says, unless you accept the kingdom like a little child, you shall by no means enter it. One of the things he qualifies that with is temptations to sin must come, but woe to the one through whom temptation comes. Why? Because he's creating a place where, in addition to his children being able to fulfill their potential in terms of their ambitions and their talents and their hearts, they are no longer beset by the temptations of the sin that so easily ensnares. And so part of us reaching our potential is not simply living in an environment where we are encouraged to make the most of our potential. We are no longer distracted by the things that would cause us to stumble. We don't have to worry about the promise in 1 John chapter 1 anymore, where if you walk in the light as he is in the light, the blood of Christ is constantly cleansing you from all sin. Why? Because the things that would cause us to stumble, they don't exist anymore. So when he's writing in this passage about a place where the sparrow feels safe, a place where his soul longs to be, and even his flesh sings for joy, it's because all of those things that Paul described even in his own walk, where he's like, the thing that I don't want to do, there it is, right? Paul didn't have to worry about that anymore. And he's in a place where he's simply encouraged to reach his potential. Why is that important? We talked about Psalm 72 last week. What did Solomon, God's righteous king, have either his father pray for him or pray for himself at the outset of his kingdom? Well, if we believe that Psalm 72 is a good reflection of that, one of the things he said is make this kingdom a place where the righteous flourish. And so when we saw in Solomon the desire to make it a place not only where his kingdom prospered, but where everybody who pursued righteousness was put in a place where they could succeed, then it makes complete sense when we understand why the sons of Korah are writing in Psalm 84, where we are today, about the peace that they feel in thinking about a place where they are encouraged to reach their potential. Verse 4, blessed are those who dwell in your house, ever singing your praise. Verse 5, blessed are those whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the highways to Zion. As they go through the valleys of Baca, they make it a place of springs. And I paused there after a while and wondered, a place of springs? I got nothing to say there. What does that even mean? Can't say that I understand it exactly now, but I do know that springs in the environment in which they lived, that was some parts wilderness, some parts fertile ground, were a place of refreshing. And so when you're looking at his description of the kind of people who are there, he says, blessed are those whose strength is in the Lord, whose heart are highways to Zion. It's something we've heard over and over again. The reason why we have Joseph, the reason why we have David, and stories that have endured to this point, they weren't the only successful men in Israel, but they were men through whom God blessed many. A story I left out early on, Daniel. If Daniel would have been just like all the other wise men in the kingdom, where would salvation have come from? It wouldn't have, because the king was about to kill all the wise men. So understand how when you have a talent that sets you apart, or makes you different, or doesn't necessarily allow you to fit, how fitting in dumbs down the ability for God to use you to work out salvation. Understand that if Daniel had been just like everybody else, if he wasn't willing to eat food that was different from what was set out at the king's table, if he wasn't willing to testify or prophesy a little bit differently than all the other wise men, we don't know if God would have chosen to speak through him at all. He might have been swept away and killed with all of the other prophets that the king had at that point seen through. See, because when we're out in the world, it doesn't necessarily take a Christian to see through certain things, right? And so even though this king wasn't necessarily a disciple or a servant of God, he saw through some things that were odd with his wise men, his servants, and his prophets. And he said in the famous story, if you are really my prophets, tell me what I dreamed, right? And the beauty of Daniel is like, look, I can't tell you, but if you give me a minute, I know who can. And he had a relationship that didn't premise itself on, if you give me a minute, I think I can figure something out. Because that's the temptation when God has blessed us, right? Over a certain period of time. And we have a relationship with him. And over time, it just starts to feel like it might be the product of me and stuff I'm thinking and great ideas that I've had. But if I start to really realize through, as the Hebrew writer says, those who by reason of use have trained their senses to discern good from evil. He talks about those who are fit for spiritual meat as opposed to milk. If I get in the habit of understanding that the mysteries are too big for me, but none of them are too big for God, then that might be the kind of heart that God is still willing to bless even in adversity. And all we know about Daniel is he was willing to still be different. Why? Because there was an exalted position that was waiting for him that required him to be a misfit for a season. And so understand, when we're reading this psalm about a place of refuge, sometimes it requires us to be a misfit. The word says preaching in season and out of season. Sometimes it requires us to be a misfit out of our season, so that when God brings salvation, we're prepared to say exactly what he's called us to say, to be exactly what he's called us to be, and do exactly what he's called us to do after we have suffered for a little while. So understand how the parallels work both here on earth and in the eternal. See, because this is pointing to the eternal home that we have. But we get down payments on that in life, in these men and women whose story said, after barrenness, there is birth. After being the outcast, there is second in command of the largest power on earth. After being a simple shepherd boy who was thought foolish by his own peers, he is now poised to be the king. We get them as physical examples of heavenly things that Psalm 84 gives us. And why is that important? Because we're not all going to be kings. We're not all going to be CEOs. We're not all going to be presidents on this side. And so ultimately, the more we're able to take lessons from the lives of those of our people who are successful in those ways, the less I have to have ambition in my own heart to be like somebody else, to run in their lane. The more I'm able to find encouragement and comfort from the success of other people who I've seen suffer too. I remember not too long ago, there was this saying that we have in the African American community. Talking about being black again, y'all. And ultimately, because we spent so many years in oppression, one of the things that became cliche for us to latch on to is we were kings. Back when we were in Africa, we were kings. We were not always enslaved. And I saw a movie not too long ago. It wasn't a great movie, but one of the quotes that stuck with me was, if we could shed the burden of feeling like we always have to be kings, if we could learn to be content just being who we are, even if that's average, then the cross wouldn't necessarily be so heavy. Me trying to be someone I'm not, trying to fulfill a role that I was never designed for, all for shaking the shame of slavery, servitude, whatever the source of shame might be. See, not every people group has a history of enslavement, but everybody has an opportunity, if you pick up the cross of Christ, to be ostracized for something. And to the degree we aren't tempted, as Carson Wentz and Nick Foles might have been, to jump ship for teams where they weren't really a good fit, there is a time when God will exalt us into a position where we simply have refuge, as in Psalm 84. Moving forward. Those who find a home there are not simply, once again, we said, a blessing to themselves. They're a blessing to those around them. But moving forward, we'll also see that there are people who were suited for God's purpose. And that was when I mentioned the good pasture, the good tools, and the vestibules. That was what the good tools were. Understand who Moses was. God could have picked anybody. But one of the things we notice about Moses is when God said something, maybe it's the fact that Moses wasn't so good at talking that made him a fit tool to simply stick to the script. Maybe if you look at the life of Noah, we don't know what his relative strengths or weaknesses were, but we do know at the end of that story, before they hopped in the ark, the Bible has this one clause that constantly catches my attention when I read that story. Noah did all that he was asked to do. And so understand, when we're looking at that whole concept of what makes a person a true blessing in the hand of God, he's called entire nations, like an axe handle, right? He's like, don't let the axe handle boast itself as if it wields the owner. Likewise, he says that to a nation. It's the same thing in application to us. The thing that helps make me fit for God is he might not be using me at this particular time, but when he needs to build that shed, it's my opportunity, if I am like an axe head, to keep myself sharp in the meantime. Can you imagine how frustrating it would be to go out to your shop to do a project, and every time you had to start another project, you had to resharpen that axe head? Because they're not designed to be dull. The ones that are better are designed to hold an edge, to be sharp every time you use them. They are inanimate objects. We are thinking beings. God designed us beings. God designed us that way for a reason. Why? Because in the meantime, just like that Hebrew writer said, those who are useful for God are useful because by reason of use, that means constant practice, they stay sharp for the next time God has an opportunity. And that's one of the downsides to waiting. I've heard the term, sometimes we can be so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good. And sometimes that comes out of passages like this, though, even though they give us encouragement, sometimes we have to remember that they're giving us encouragement not at the expense of what our job should be now. As we reviewed some of the prior passages in the Psalms, we looked at MacGyver as an example of someone who stayed focused on doing an inventory of what he had available. And likewise, now we're in Psalm 84. One of the things that it's required of us to do is to have a balance between hoping for a place where we fit and the kind of mentality and character that allows us to stay productive where we are in the moment. So that when God comes back to us, he doesn't have to sharpen us all over again because we're staying ready for his good use. Much like Daniel, he's not having to rebuild a relationship with Daniel because Daniel is constantly seeking God's will. It's the same repetitive pattern we see over and over again. Moses was effective for God because as each new plague came, he was in the habit of listening and waiting for what God had to say. Why? Because as we already said, he understood that in his weakness, his only articulation before Pharaoh was going to rest in simply repeating what he was told to do. And so it's in that relationship where we stay sharp that God finds us as an effective tool for his use. And so going on in verse 8, we're going to talk about the vestibule. Need water. We're going to talk about the vestibule. O Lord, God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, O God of Jacob. Behold our shield, O God. Look on the face of your anointed. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness. As I draw to a close, what that brought to mind was a time in which, after coming back from the mission field, I had the chance to basically work as a doorkeeper in one of the oil companies in Texas. I don't think it was until after I had that experience that I began to put two and two together, because there are plenty of years I'd read this passage, I'd be like, doorkeeper, that's okay, but I'm striving. Yeah, right? And sometimes we get like that. I should be happy with being a doorkeeper. And you know when it's easy to be happy being a doorkeeper? Times when I've fallen and considered the potential that I might not be there at all. Times like that, I really appreciate the doorkeeper thing, right? Because I realize the alternative ain't so good. Oh, but when I'm flying high and things are going well, the doorkeeper seems kind of like, But I've been a doorkeeper. And I've been a doorkeeper in a relatively good environment, where I had the opportunity to say, it's my job, my excuse to be nice to people. I'm paid to say hi and really try to set the tone for people's day. If you do that out in the streets, people are going to look at you like you're weird. A little bit different, right? But once again, this passage is describing a place where it's not weird to just be nice and to be kind. And people don't have to pay you to make it normal. Here's the tough side of that job. I was just a human, as y'all get to see now, right? And there are times when you're going to mess up, right? And sometimes folks aren't going to be able to get past the fact that you messed up. Why? Because it's your fault. You shouldn't have done it, right? But part of the beauty of being a doorkeeper in the house of God comes from my frame of reference of being a doorkeeper in a good place, a healthy environment that encouraged me to reach my potential here on earth. Why? Because I wasn't so much defined for my mistakes. Understand the application to each one of you. God bless you when you find an environment where you're defined by your walk, the degree to which you set a tone for love and for kindness and trying to uplift the organization. So in times when you stumble, even though there are going to be some who rightly so are going to have a hard time getting over what it is you've been or what it is you've done, you'll get to see the beauty in relationships of those who show you that they understand and they appreciate your walk even more than your flaws or your faults. And understand how in Psalm 84, when he says just a day, I was like, really? A day? But I could realize that once I realized that place where I found so much encouragement, much like here, a place where I found so much encouragement, is free of that portion of the organization that would fixate on the things I didn't necessarily do so well on a performance evaluation. And it's filled with the people who, as we asked at the outset, who were encouraging me to reach my potential. Then I began to appreciate once again why this person was eager for just a day in that place. Understand, Noah's not the kind of person you would want to have plan your after party, all right? Because after getting off of the ark, he had planted a vineyard, celebrated a little too much, right? David's not the guy you might want to go for marriage counseling because, yeah, right? And likewise, Moses is not the guy you probably want to turn to for anger management training because he choked the guy and he struck the rock. But understand the ways in which Psalm 84 might be a relief to men who God encouraged to say, look, I need you to get back up and get back on the right path, right? Because at the end of that right path is a host of people who will recognize you. That's all right, that's all right. I cry too. Wrap it up. Wrap it up. But at the end of that road is a host of people who value you, much like we see in Hebrews 11, the Faith Hall of Fame, for the things you got right. Because the thing that we all have in common is the things we got wrong. And so is it a license to continue down the wrong path? No. Why? Because we see in verse 11, for the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord bestows favor and honor. No good thing does he withhold from those who walk uprightly. So when we stumble, the responsibility is, much like we want the blessing of being around people who we can completely trust and we find completely trustworthy, our responsibility is to not take the blood of Christ in vain, as we see in 1 John once again, first chapter, verse 7. Even though he's continually cleansing us from sin as we stumble, our job is to get back onto the path in which there is cleansing. And to the degree to which we do, God has promised us something that is Once again, we've said it before, more miraculous than moving mountains. I told you about my frustration I think I've shared with other preachers. When I was young, I thought that there was a need to grow my faith by testing out that passage that says, if you have even the faith of a mustard seed, you can tell this mountain to be cast into the sea and have it work. And once I grew up, I realized that there were mountains of adversity and discipline and overcoming in my own life that I would need to test that passage on, as opposed to trying to chuck rocks into a sea. And the reality is, I think because ultimately the story is one of reconciliation, as we see Paul write frequently in 2 Corinthians, I think if I can trust him enough to cleanse me from dead works and to move those mountains of adversity and temptation and trial in my own life, I can have hope of finally being in a place like this where all the struggle, as he said, all the labor is no longer in vain. I'm simply in a place where I'm encouraged to reach my potential. So my encouragement for all of us this week is we looked at Psalm 84. Probably go back on it and read over it on your own. Study it, because there can be times when I preach the text and as I'm preparing the review, I'll be like, where'd all that come from, Marcus? So the things I highlight in the text aren't necessarily things that you might relate to most. But understand, the bottom line, whether or not I preached accurately according to Psalm 84, or I should have just stepped it up a little bit, it's talking about a place where you no longer have to be concerned about your fit. Because his call to wait is finally a reality. Talk about musicians every week now. My favorite musicians talks about, I can't wait until the day where I don't have to have the faith anymore. It's simply sight. And so Psalm 84 is talking about a day when it's simply sight. You don't have to wait on the promise of God. It's saying there's a place where you fit. You'll simply fit. And I'm encouraging us all to wait for that day. Thank you.
588.